rancher's baby was dying of hunger after his wife passed, until a widow knocked with milk, healed by grief. The wind screamed across the open land of Sage Creek, Wyoming, in the winter of 1879. It carried with it sharp flakes of snow that cut at the skin and rattled the cabin walls as if the prairie itself wanted to tear them down. Inside, Samuel Hart sat hunched by the cradle, his big hands trembling as he tried to steady the baby who would not stop crying. His beard was rough, his eyes hollow from nights without sleep, and his shirt clung damp to his back, though the air inside the cabin was as cold as outside. The fire in the hearth had burned low, the logs reduced to glowing embers, yet he had not moved to stir them. Every thought in him was chained to the child. The baby's cries tore through him like claws. Tiny fists beat the air, her face red and scrunched, her chest heaving with hunger. He lifted her gently, whispering against her soft hair, "Please, little one, hush now, Papa's here." But his voice carried no strength, only the frayed edges of a man broken down. He tried again with the small bottle, warmed as best as he could with goat's milk, but she turned her head away and wailed louder. The bottle slipped from his fingers and rolled across the rough floorboards, spilling drops of milk that hissed when they struck the hot iron near the fire. Samuel pressed the baby to his chest, rocking in the chair that had been his wife's. He remembered how Mary had sung in it while she nursed, her voice carrying soft and sweet over the crackle of the hearth. She had been strong, full of light even when she was weary from work, and he had believed she would never leave him. But death had come quick after the birthing, stealing her away before the baby even learned her face. That had been 1 month ago, though to Samuel, it felt like years of darkness. He rubbed his hand over his face, his beard scratching against his palm, his throat thick with a pain that words could not ease. Each night he prayed for guidance. Each morning he rose, built fires, fed the stock, and tried to coax his daughter to live, but she grew thinner, her cries sharper, and he felt the fear that he was losing her too. His body ached from labor, but it was the ache inside his chest that nearly drove him to his knees. Outside, the storm deepened. The cabin shuddered as snow piled against its sides, and the sound of the wind was like a chorus of mourners. Samuel closed his eyes and pressed his lips to the baby's damp forehead. "I will not let you go," he whispered, though his voice cracked under the weight of it. His heart throbbed with helplessness, his arms tight around the only piece of Mary he had left. The storm raged, the fire faded, and inside the lonely cabin, a father fought against despair, clinging to his daughter's fragile breath as if it were the last light in all the world. Samuel Hart sat at the table with his head bowed, his shoulders heavy from days without rest. The winter storm had eased, yet the cold inside the cabin was still fierce. He set another small bottle in the pan of warm water by the fire, watching the steam curl into the air as if it carried all his hopes with it. The baby stirred in her cradle, her soft cries rising into sharp wails that cut through the silence like knives. He hurried to lift her, his big hands awkward but careful, rocking her against his chest, while whispering words he barely remembered from the hymns Mary once sang. He brought the bottle to her lips and tried again. She turned away, her little face red and twisted with hunger. Samuel pressed the tip gently, praying she would take it, but the baby pushed back with her tongue and let out a scream that pierced straight through him. His hands shook as he pulled it away. He had tried goat's milk warmed to every degree he thought might please her, tried mixing honey with water, even soaked bread in the milk and squeezed drops into her tiny mouth. Nothing worked. Each effort ended the same, with tears burning in his eyes, and his daughter's cries growing weaker, not stronger. He remembered riding through the bitter wind a week ago, leaving the child swaddled by the fire while he searched for help. He had gone first to the Millers, who looked on him with pity and sorrow. Their children were grown, their arms empty. He rode to the Grants, to the Swensons, to the farmsteads scattered across 10 miles of frozen land, asking at every door, "Do you know of a woman nursing? Anyone at all?" Each answer was the same: a soft shake of the head, a hand on his arm, a murmur of apology. At the church, the pastor bowed his head and said he would pray. Yet Samuel left with nothing more than the sound of his own heart pounding with dread. He had returned to the cabin with his clothes stiff from frost, his lips cracked, and his spirit hollow. That night he painted the words on a rough piece of board: "Infant starving, milk needed." He nailed it to the gate with trembling hands, the hammer slipping more than once. The wind tried to tear it away, but he drove the nails deeper until the wood splintered. He thought someone would come. Someone must. Days had passed, and only the storm had answered. Now he rocked his daughter in the dim light, her cries breaking into hoarse whimpers, her small body weakening in his arms. His chest ached with guilt, with helpless rage at his own uselessness. He pressed his lips to her hair, whispering, "I will not fail you, little one," though fear told him he already had. The cabin walls closed in with silence between her cries. The fire snapped low, and Samuel felt himself standing at the edge of despair, clutching the child as though she were the last breath left in his world. The sky was gray with low clouds that pressed against the plains, and snow drifted across the land in slow sheets that swallowed every track within minutes. Samuel Hart stood at the gate of his ranch, his breath rising in white clouds, his hands raw from the cold. In his grip he held a rough plank of wood he had torn from the shed, the edges splintered and sharp. He balanced it across the rail, and with a stub of charcoal he scrawled words that seemed too heavy for his trembling hand. "Infant starving, milk needed." The letters came out uneven, crooked, black against the pale wood, but they were clear enough to any soul who passed. He hammered it into place, the sound echoing across the empty land like gunshots. The wind shoved against his back, nearly tearing the board free. But he drove the nails harder, his arm aching with every strike. His daughter's weak cries carried from the cabin, barely heard above the howling gusts. He paused only to listen, his heart tight, then lifted the hammer again. The last nail bent, but he left it there, unwilling to waste the strength to pull it out. He leaned on the post, head bowed, snow clinging to his beard and lashes. It was a plea written to strangers, to the whole of the world, to anyone who might bring salvation to his child. He trudged back to the cabin, the sound of his boots muffled by the snow. Inside, the air was stale with smoke and damp wool. The baby stirred in the cradle, her fists weak against the blanket, her voice no longer sharp but thin and broken. Samuel sank into the chair and gathered her into his arms. He whispered as he rocked, telling her stories of the spring calves and the tall grass that would rise when the thaw came. His words were hollow, but he spoke them anyway, trying to fill the room with something other than despair. Day slipped into night, and night into another gray dawn. Each time he stepped outside, the signs still stood, the letters stark against the snow. He looked to the horizon, waiting for riders, for wagons, for the sound of hooves or voices. Nothing came. Only the wind answered, whistling through the bare cottonwoods. His hope thinned with every passing hour. But still, he kept the fire burning and the cradle close, willing the world to hear. On the fourth evening he stood again at the gate, staring at the sign, his eyes red and stinging. His hand brushed the rough wood as though touching it could make the plea louder. "Infant starving, milk needed." The words seemed to shout back at him, reminding him of his helplessness. He lifted his face to the wind, his jaw tight. "Lord, do not let her die," he whispered, though the storm swallowed his prayer. Snow fell harder, blurring the horizon, and Samuel turned back toward the cabin, clutching the doorframe as he stepped inside, knowing only the child's fragile breath kept him standing at all. The storm came down in sheets that night, the wind shrieking as if the whole prairie were alive with sorrow. Snow drove against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters, finding every crack to creep through. Samuel Hart sat in the rocking chair, his daughter pressed to his chest, her cries weak but steady. He had tried the bottle once more, tried warming it, tried coaxing her with soft words, but she would not take it. Her body trembled against him, and his own strength was fading. He rocked harder, whispering, "I am here, little one. I will not leave you." Though his heart ached with the knowledge that his love could not fill her stomach. The fire hissed low, the shadows lengthened, and Samuel felt himself slipping into the edge of despair when the sound came. 3 knocks against the door, quick and uneven, cutting through the howl of the wind. He froze, his arms tightening around the baby, his breath caught in his throat. He thought he had imagined it, a cruel trick of the storm. But then it came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. The baby startled, her cry lifting for a moment. Then she wailed again. Samuel rose, legs stiff, heart pounding. He pulled the door open a crack, and the wind shoved it wide, slapping him with icy air. A figure stood on the porch, cloaked and dripping with snow, hair plastered to her cheeks. Her lips trembled as she spoke. "Please, sir, I need shelter, just for the night." Samuel stared at her, too tired to think, and stepped aside without a word. She moved in slowly, her boots leaving wet prints on the floor, her hands clutching a small cloth bag. Her eyes lifted to the cradle, and then to the bundle in Samuel's arms. The baby let out another piercing cry, thin and broken. The woman stopped, her breath caught, and her hand flew to her chest. Dark patches spread across the fabric of her blouse, and her eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "5 months ago I bore a son, and 2 months later he died." Her voice shook, and she pressed her hand harder to her breast. "My body does not understand. The milk still comes. Every day I throw it away." Her lips trembled, her eyes locked on the baby. "Let me help, please." Samuel could not speak. His throat was too tight, his mind spinning with disbelief. The baby squirmed and wailed, reaching blindly. At last he nodded, silent. The woman set down her bag, her hands shaking as she unfastened her cloak. She reached for the child with careful arms, and Samuel placed his daughter into them. The infant rooted at once, desperate, and found what she had been starving for. The sound of suckling filled the room, steady, strong, and the woman wept as the baby drank. Samuel stood still, watching as life returned to his child, and in that moment, the storm outside seemed to soften, as if even the wind knew something had shifted within those walls. Samuel stood, rooted to the floor, his breath caught in his chest as he watched the woman cradle his child. The baby's cries had turned into frantic whimpers, her tiny head searching until she found what she needed. Then at last she latched, her small mouth pressing against the woman's breast, and the sound that followed was the sweetest Samuel had ever heard. It was the steady rhythm of his daughter swallowing, the sharp sobs replaced by desperate gulps of life. The woman gasped, her shoulders shaking as tears poured down her cheeks. She whispered broken words to the infant. "It is all right, little one. I have you. Drink now. You are safe." Samuel's hands twitched at his sides. He had tried for weeks, worn himself down to bone and shadow, and all it took was this stranger, wet from the storm and trembling from her own grief, to give his daughter what he could not. He felt shame twist inside him, but also a fierce surge of relief that nearly brought him to his knees. He stepped closer, his voice rough. "Is she taking it?" The woman looked up, her face wet, and nodded. Her lips trembled. "She is starving, but she is strong. She will live now." The fire cracked and threw warm light across the room. Samuel felt the weight in his chest loosen, though his body still shook from the sight. His daughter's tiny fists, once clenched in hunger, now rested open against the woman's blouse. Her cries softened into the steady suck and swallow, and her little body shuddered with peace. The woman closed her eyes and rocked, her lips brushing the baby's damp hair as she whispered, "Thank you, thank you." Samuel did not know if she spoke to him or to the child or to heaven itself, but he felt the words settle deep inside him. When at last the baby slowed, her small mouth slipping free, she sighed and curled against the woman's chest, already drifting into sleep. Samuel's eyes burned. He reached for a blanket and gently draped it over them both. The woman flinched at first, then gave him a small nod, her hands still wrapped around the baby as if she would never let go. "What is your name?" he asked softly, his voice carrying a weight of gratitude he could not put into words. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara Bennett." He swallowed hard and said, "I am Samuel Hart, and this here is my daughter, Grace." Clara looked down at Grace, her lips trembling as she kissed the baby's forehead. The storm still roared outside, but inside the cabin there was warmth, where before there had only been despair. Samuel lowered himself into the chair across from her, his hands loose for the first time in weeks. He watched as Grace slept soundly in the arms of a stranger who already seemed bound to her by something more than chance. Samuel knew in his heart that whatever happened next, the night his daughter first nursed from Clara Bennett would forever mark the turning of his life. The storm eased by morning, leaving the land buried in white silence. The cabin stood against the wind like a tired sentinel, smoke curling thin from its chimney. Inside, the air was warmer than it had been in weeks. Clara Bennett moved quietly, her shawl drying by the fire, her bag tucked beneath the cot Samuel had built years ago for hired men who never came. She rose before dawn when Grace whimpered, gathering the baby with practiced ease, unfastening her bodice with hands that no longer shook. Samuel watched from the shadows of his chair, his body stiff from sleeping upright, his eyes following every movement. Grace settled fast in Clara's arms, her cries softening into little sighs as she nursed. Samuel felt something stir in his chest, relief mixed with an ache he could not name. Clara hummed under her breath, low and steady, a sound that filled the cracks of the cabin with gentleness. When Grace finished, Clara wiped her chin and rocked her until she fell back into sleep. Samuel stood then, not wanting her to think he had been staring. He reached for the fire and added wood, the flames rising strong again. Clara smiled faintly, as though grateful for the warmth, and laid the baby in the cradle. Samuel cleared his throat. "You can take the cot," he said, nodding toward the corner. She turned, surprised, and saw the rough pine frame he had hammered together the day before, a wool blanket folded neatly on top. Her eyes softened. "You did not have to." Samuel rubbed the back of his neck. "It ain't much, but it's yours while you are here." Clara's lips curved in the smallest of smiles. "It is more than I had last night." Days slipped into a rhythm, neither of them planned. Samuel left a jar of bear fat by her basin, scrawling in blocky letters for your hands. Clara said nothing of it, though her fingers lingered on the lid before she used it. In return, she cooked beans with a strip of pork, boiled onions into broth, and swept the floor each morning until the boards shone. Grace thrived in her care, her cheeks rounding, her sleep easy. Samuel felt a weight lift from his shoulders every time he heard the baby's soft breathing. At night, Clara sometimes sat by the fire, pretending to mend a shirt, though Samuel saw the tears she wiped when she thought no one noticed. He wanted to ask, wanted to speak of the grief that haunted them both, but the words caught like burrs in his throat. Instead, he fixed the latch on the window, patched the leak in the roof, and set kindling by the hearth, so she would not wake cold. She, in turn, folded his shirts even when he had not asked, and when Grace cried in the night, she always rose first, though Samuel was never far behind with a blanket or candle. They spoke little, yet the silence between them was no longer empty. It was shared, shaped by loss, and softened by the fragile comfort of not being alone. Sage Creek was small, the kind of place where every new face was noticed before the dust had even settled on the road. By the time Clara walked into town for the first time, word had already spread. She kept her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, her eyes lowered as she stepped into Miller's general store. She asked for flour, soa prut, and a length of cloth, her voice soft but steady. The storekeeper filled her order without comment, but Clara felt the weight of stares pressing down on her back. Women whispered behind shelves of canned peaches, men paused by barrels of grain, their voices dropping as soon as she turned her head. She did not need to hear the words to know what they meant. When she left the store, the air outside was sharp with cold. Her boots crunched on frozen ground as she hurried toward the wagon Samuel had lent her. A man tipped his hat, but the smile that followed carried no warmth. Two women crossed the street, their chatter stopping mid-word as Clara passed. She climbed into the wagon seat, her hands trembling as she gripped the reins. She told herself it did not matter, that she had lived with heavier grief than this, but their silence cut all the same. Back at the cabin, the air was warmer, the fire steady, Grace cooing happily in her cradle. Samuel was mending a harness by the window, his broad back turned toward her as she stepped inside. He looked over his shoulder, gave her a short nod, and went back to his work. Clara set down the parcel, and knelt by the baby, pressing a kiss to Grace's soft cheek. The child smiled in her sleep, and Clara's heart swelled and broke in the same moment. She whispered, "I will not let them take you, little one," though no one was there to hear. In town, the whispers grew sharper. Some said she had come with nothing but a bag and sorrow, that she fed Samuel's baby with milk meant for another child. Others muttered that a man with land and loneliness might find reason enough to keep a woman without a name. It spread through the church pews, across the benches at the blacksmith's, in hushed voices outside the saloon. Samuel heard some of it himself, though he never spoke of it. At Miller's store one afternoon, a ranch hand muttered loud enough for all to hear, "Must be nice having a woman under his roof for more than cooking." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, paid for his salt, and walked out with his shoulders rigid. Clara felt it even if she did not hear it. She carried Grace through town with her chin lifted, but the sting of eyes followed. At night, she sat by the fire pretending to sew while her thoughts circled like wolves. She had lost her own child. Now she had found another, and still the world whispered she had no right to hold her. She tucked Grace against her chest, rocking her gently, her tears hidden in the child's dark curls, and told herself she belonged here, even if no one else believed it. The night was bitter cold, the kind that froze the air before a breath could leave the lips. Clara sat by the fire with Grace cradled against her chest, rocking her slowly, though her own hands trembled too much to keep steady. She had heard the voices that afternoon outside the cabin, men passing by in a wagon. Their words carried through the thin walls. They had not knocked, but they had spoken loud enough. "Ain't natural," one had said. "A woman shows up with no child of her own, still flowing milk, and living under a rancher's roof." Another voice had followed, sharp and certain. "She is planning something. She will not stay for nothing." Clara's heart had clutched tight, her body stiff as stone as she listened. When the sound of wheels faded, she could not shake the wound their words left. Now she stared into the fire, her eyes hollow with sleeplessness. Samuel slept near the hearth, his body stretched on the floor, his hand resting close to the cradle that no longer held the baby. Clara had not laid Grace down at all, afraid of the silence that might follow if she let go. She pressed her lips to the child's hair, whispering, "They will take you from me, little one. They will not let us be." And her tears wet the baby's blanket. The wind clawed at the shutters, rattling them like ghostly fingers. Clara rose suddenly, her chest heaving, and tied her shawl around her shoulders. She wrapped Grace tightly, pressing the child close, then moved to the door. The cold met her like a knife. Snow whipped through the darkness, stinging her cheeks, seeping into her shoes with every step. She held Grace tighter, stumbling into the storm with no thought of where she was going. The only thing in her mind was the fear of losing this child, of being cast out, of hearing the whispers grow into action. She muttered through her tears, "You are mine now. You are all I have left," and rocked as she walked, though her feet sank deep into the snow. Grace cried louder, her voice thin and panicked, her little body twisting against the cold. Clara dropped to her knees near a thicket of trees, the storm swirling around them, and bent low to shield her with her own body. Her hair stuck to her face, her breath came ragged, and she swayed back and forth in the snow, whispering nonsense to calm the baby, words tumbling from a heart breaking beneath its own weight. "They do not know. They do not understand. You are mine. You will not be taken." The storm answered with a roar. The trees groaned, the ground beneath her knees turning to ice. She clutched Grace tighter, too tight, her own arms shaking. The baby wailed in her ear, the sound tearing into the night. Clara's eyes burned with tears that froze as they fell. She pressed her cheek to Grace's damp hair and closed her eyes, her mind a blur of grief and fear, convinced that running was the only way to keep what she had already lost once before. Samuel woke with a start, his body stiff from the floor, his hand reaching for the cradle as he always did. His fingers touched only cold wool. He blinked against the dim glow of the dying fire, his chest tightening when he saw the cradle empty, the shawl missing, and the front door open a crack with snow curling in. Fear struck him harder than any blow he had ever known. He called out Clara's name, his voice raw, then cried Grace, but only the storm answered. His heart pounded as he pulled on his boots, yanked his coat from its peg, and stumbled into the night. The storm had eaten most of the land. The world around him turned white and endless. Samuel saddled his horse with shaking hands, his teeth clenched against the prayer on his lips. "Please, Lord, let me find them." The mare pushed against the wind as he kicked her into a gallop, snow slicing into his face, the night swallowing everything but the pounding of hooves. He searched for prints, scraps of cloth, any sign that Clara had passed, but the snow erased tracks within moments. He leaned low, scanning the ground, his breath coming hard and fast. Minutes dragged like hours until at last he saw it. A shadow against the broken frame of the old hay barn, long abandoned since the roof had caved in 2 winters before. He leapt from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, stumbling through the drifts toward the figure crouched against the splintered wall. Clara sat with her back pressed to the boards, her shawl wrapped tight around a trembling bundle, her hair wild with snow, her lips blue. She rocked forward and back, whispering words he could not hear, her eyes wide and haunted. Samuel dropped to his knees in front of her, his breath burning in his lungs. "Clara, it is me," he called over the roar of the wind. She looked up, her eyes wild, and clutched the baby tighter. "No one is taking her," Clara whispered, her voice broken. "They will say I do not belong. They will send me away. I will lose her too." Samuel's throat closed as he reached out slowly, careful not to startle her. "I am not here to take her," he said softly. "I am here to bring you both home." Her shoulders shook as sobs burst free. She cried, "She feels like mine, but she is not, and I could not lose her again." Samuel's own eyes burned. "You have not lost her," he said, his voice thick. "You saved her." He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, then gathered them both into his arms. Clara did not fight, her body stiff with cold, but leaning into him as if some part of her still trusted. Grace whimpered weakly, her small cry breaking the storm's silence, then settled against her chest. Samuel pressed his cheek to Clara's damp hair and whispered, "You are not nothing. You are the reason my daughter still breathes." He lifted them both, his arms straining but sure, and carried them back through the snow. The storm raged around him, yet he did not falter. In his heart there was no room left for despair, only the fierce vow that he would not lose them. Not that night, not ever again. The sky was sharp and pale the morning the riders came. Samuel was outside splitting kindling, his sleeves rolled high, his breath misting in the brittle air. Each strike of the axe rang clear across the frozen yard, steady and calm, the rhythm of a man who worked with purpose. Inside the cabin, Clara rocked Grace, humming softly, while the baby drowsed against her breast. She felt a strange peace, though. Her eyes still carried shadows from the night Samuel had found her in the storm. That peace shattered when she heard the sound of hooves crunching through the snow. She stiffened, clutching Grace tighter as 3 horses drew near, their riders hard-faced and silent, until they reined up at the porch. One man swung down, tall with a scar that dragged across his cheek, his eyes cold. Another wore a deputy's badge, though Clara knew he had not worked an honest day in months. The third lingered at his side, grinning as though he had come for easy sport. The scarred man spat into the snow and called, "Cole, time's up." Samuel straightened, the axe hanging loose in his hand. He set it aside, his voice even, "I do not reckon I know what you mean." The deputy sneered, "Your brother's debt lies on this land, and that makes it yours now." Samuel wiped his palms against his trousers, his jaw hard. "My brother's choices were his own, and they do not bind me." The scarred man stepped closer, his boots crunching in the snow. "Papers say otherwise. You pay, or we take." Clara stood at the window, her heart racing as she pressed Grace tighter against her chest. The baby stirred and whimpered, her small sounds swallowed by the men's harsh voices. Samuel's shoulders squared, his voice low but sure. "You will not take a thing from this house, not from that child." The deputy let out a laugh. "1 man against 3, and a tired horse in your barn? You reckon you can stop us? Samuel stepped to the porch, calm, his eyes steady. A man fights hardest when he has nothing left but what matters most, and I will fight for mine. The scarred man's hand drifted toward his belt. That a threat, Hart? Samuel reached for the oilcloth at the corner of the porch, unwrapping it with slow care. A rifle gleamed in the cold light, its stock worn from years of use. He held it with the ease of a man who knew its weight, though he did not raise it. His voice carried firm. This is not a quarrel with honest men, but if you cross my threshold to steal, you will answer to more than me. A hush fell, the wind tugging at coats and hats, and from down the road townsfolk had begun to gather, drawn by the standoff. Their eyes widened, whispers spreading quick. One voice, an old woman's, carried clear. That is Hart's ranch. The baby lives there. And the milkwoman. The men shifted uneasily, their boldness frayed under the eyes of witnesses. The scarred man spat once more and growled, "This is not over." Samuel's voice did not shake. "Maybe not, but I will never regret protecting my family." The word struck Clara like a bell. Family. She pressed her lips to Grace's soft hair, tears spilling as she whispered, "We are his family." On the porch, Samuel lowered the rifle at last, his chest rising with heavy breaths, the storm in his heart settling into something stronger. The men turned, mounting their horses, riding off into the wind with curses on their tongues. Samuel watched them fade into the distance, then stepped back into the cabin, boots heavy with snow, his eyes softening when he saw Clara. She stood there trembling, Grace asleep in her arms, and in that moment she believed the word he had spoken was true. The sky was sharp and pale the morning the riders came. Samuel was outside splitting kindling, his sleeves rolled high, his breath misting in the brittle air. Each strike of the axe rang clear across the frozen yard, steady and calm, the rhythm of a man who worked with purpose. Inside the cabin, Clara rocked Grace, humming softly while the baby drowsed against her breast. She felt a strange peace, though her eyes still carried shadows from the night Samuel had found her in the storm. That peace shattered when she heard the sound of hooves crunching through the snow. She stiffened, clutching Grace tighter as 3 horses drew near, their riders hard-faced and silent until they reined up at the porch. One man swung down, tall with a scar that dragged across his cheek, his eyes cold. Another wore a deputy's badge, though Clara knew he had not worked an honest day in months. The third lingered at his side, grinning as though he had come for easy sport. The scarred man spat into the snow and called, "Cole, time's up!" Samuel straightened, the axe hanging loose in his hand. He set it aside, his voice even, "I do not reckon I know what you mean." The deputy sneered, "Your brother's debt lies on this land, and that makes it yours now." Samuel wiped his palms against his trousers, his jaw hard. "My brother's choices were his own, and they do not bind me." The scarred man stepped closer, his boots crunching in the snow. "Papers say otherwise. You pay, or we take." Clara stood at the window, her heart racing as she pressed Grace tighter against her chest. The baby stirred and whimpered, her small sounds swallowed by the men's harsh voices. Samuel's shoulders squared, his voice low but sure. "You will not take a thing from this house, not from that child." The deputy let out a laugh. "1 man against 3, and a tired horse in your barn? You reckon you can stop us?" Samuel stepped to the porch, calm, his eyes steady. "A man fights hardest when he has nothing left but what matters most, and I will fight for mine." The scarred man's hand drifted toward his belt. "That a threat, Hart?" Samuel reached for the oilcloth at the corner of the porch, unwrapping it with slow care. A rifle gleamed in the cold light, its stock worn from years of use. He held it with the ease of a man who knew its weight, though he did not raise it. His voice carried firm, "This is not a quarrel with honest men, but if you cross my threshold to steal, you will answer to more than me." A hush fell, the wind tugging at coats and hats, and from down the road townsfolk had begun to gather, drawn by the standoff. Their eyes widened, whispers spreading quick. One voice, an old woman's, carried clear, "That is Hart's ranch. The baby lives there. And the milkwoman. The men shifted uneasily, their boldness frayed under the eyes of witnesses. The scarred man spat once more and growled, "This is not over." Samuel's voice did not shake. "Maybe not. But I will never regret protecting my family." The word struck Clara like a bell. Family. She pressed her lips to Grace's soft hair, tears spilling as she whispered, "We are his family." On the porch, Samuel lowered the rifle at last, his chest rising with heavy breaths, the storm in his heart settling into something stronger. The men turned, mounting their horses, riding off into the wind with curses on their tongues. Samuel watched them fade into the distance, then stepped back into the cabin, boots heavy with snow, his eyes softening when he saw Clara. She stood there trembling, Grace asleep in her arms, and in that moment she believed the word he had spoken was true. The years turned slowly, each season etching its mark across the wide plains, each day pulling Samuel and Clara closer into the shape of a family. 3 winters had come and gone since the stormy night she had knocked upon his door, and the cabin that once echoed with lonely cries now brimmed with laughter. Grace was 3 years old, her dark curls bouncing as she chased butterflies along the fence line, her little boots scuffing the earth. Clara stood nearby, one hand resting on her rounded belly, 7 months along, her smile soft with both joy and memory. Samuel came from the barn with a spade in one hand and a sapling in the other, its roots wrapped in damp burlap. He knelt in the earth and set the sapling down, his eyes lifting to Clara. "You ready?" he asked, his voice gentle. Clara nodded, her hand brushing across her belly as Grace bounded over, wide-eyed with curiosity. "What is it, Papa?" she asked, tugging at his sleeve. "A white fir," Samuel said, brushing the dirt from his hands. "It will grow tall and strong, and it will stand through every storm, just like us." Grace clapped her hands. "Can I help?" And he passed her a small trowel. She dug with all the seriousness her little hands could manage, and Samuel and Clara laughed softly as soil flew in every direction. Together they worked the ground, Samuel lowering the tree into place, Clara pressing earth gently around its roots, and Grace patting the dirt as if to tuck it in for sleep. The sun slipped low across the horizon, painting the sky gold and pink, the air filled with the smell of pine and the sound of Grace's giggles. Clara's fingers brushed Samuel's as they pressed the last of the soil, their eyes meeting in a quiet promise. "Why this tree?" Clara asked at last, her voice low. Samuel looked toward the horizon before he answered. "Because white fir is stubborn. It holds green through storm and snow. It survives." Clara's eyes glistened. "So do we," she said. Grace leaned against Samuel's leg, yawning, her tiny hand smudged with dirt. He lifted her into his arms, kissed the top of her head, and looked at Clara, his voice soft but steady. "If this tree stands, then so does this family." Clara nodded, her lips trembling with a smile, and placed her hand against his. "That is our promise." The firelight from the cabin flickered in the growing dusk, warm against the cold air, a beacon that carried all the weight of their journey. Inside, the hearth glowed bright. Above it, Samuel had carved 3 names into the wooden beam: Grace Cole, Clara Bennett, Samuel Hart, not bound by blood, but chosen day after day. Chosen in storms and whispers, in hunger and fear, in laughter and quiet hope. Samuel drew Clara close, Grace tucked between them, and the 3 of them stood by the window watching the young fir sway gently in the wind, its roots already gripping the soil. A new life was growing inside the cabin, another already strong outside, and love held them all together. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in love that grows even in the hardest winters, then subscribe to Western Love Legends, like this tale, and leave a comment to share your thoughts. The prairie is wide, the fire is warm, and there is always another story waiting to be told. After all, even a stubborn tree like Samuel learned that sometimes the best roots are the ones planted by a baby's tiny hands.